There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside royal houses, not peaceful, not the kind you find in a library or a garden at dusk. This silence has weight. It settles into the carpets, behind the portraits, underneath the formal greetings and the careful smiles. Anyone who has stood near the walls of Kensington Palace long enough learns to read it. I was there the afternoon it started. Not inside, obviously. Nobody like me, gets inside. But I was close enough. I've been working a courier route that passes through the residential edge of the palace grounds for going on 6 years now. You learn the rhythms. You learn which delivery entrances stay open on Thursdays. You learn the faces of the household staff, which ones nod back and which ones look straight through you. That Thursday in late October, the air had that particular London quality where it can't decide if it's finished raining, pavement still wet, sky the color of old dishwater. The horse chestnuts along the path had dropped most of their leaves and they lay in soft brown drifts against the iron fence. I remember thinking it looked like something off a biscuit tin. One of those idealized Englands that doesn't quite exist anywhere except in paintings and on biscuit tins. I had a delivery, standard. Pretty much, I wasn't lingering. But I noticed the window, 3rd floor, east side. The kind of window that's tall and narrow and framed in stone that's been there since before. Anyone alive can remember. And there was a figure standing in it. Small. A child, clearly. Standing very still in a way that children almost never stand. That contained, he held in stillness that you only learn when stillness has been required of you. She wasn't looking out at anything in particular, not the trees, not the path, not the gray sky. She was just honestly in the window. I'dn't sort of have given it a second thought. Plus, children stand at windows. That's a thing they do. Except for her hands. She had both palms pressed flat against the glass, and even from where I was, even through the fence and across that careful distance, I could see that her knuckles were white. I've thought about that image a lot, since everything that followed. The white knuckles, the pressed palms, the specific posture of a child who's holding something. In with the same determined grip she's using to touch the cold glass. She was, 9 years old. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know who she was, not with any certainty, though I had my suspicions the way anyone who works that route develops suspicions. I found out later. The way you find out most things in this city. Slowly, through fragments, through things half said over tea by people who were in rooms adjacent to the rooms where things actually happened. Her name, of course, is Princess Charlotte, which and what she was pressing her grief against that cold October glass is a story I've spent the better part of 2 months piecing together. It comes from 3 separate sources, none of whom know each other, all of whom were present at different edges of it. A member of the catering staff at a private Windsor gathering. A woman who works in estate administration and has been in that role long enough to have heard things she was never supposed to hear. And a retired protection officer whose discretion, he made very clear to me, remains absolute. Except that he told me this, so perhaps his definition of absolute is more flexible than mine. What happened to basically Charlotte isn't dramatic in the way royal scandals usually are. There's, to be fair, no document, which no photograph. TBH, no leaked recording. It's more fragile than that, which it's the story of a little girl who trusted something. Not a person exactly, but a feeling, a connection she'd built quietly in the particular way that serious, observant children build things. And then discovered that the world around her had different ideas about whether that connection was allowed to matter. And it's the for what it's worth story of what her father almost found out. Almost. I'd have to understand the context of Camilla's son. Tom Parker, actually. Bowles isn't a figure who commands the same column inches as the more central royal players. He exists, as the children of complex second marriages often exist within grand families, in a slightly softened peripheral light. He's charming, by most accounts. A food writer, well-liked at gatherings. He, has his mother's ease with a room and, people say, his father's ability to make whoever he's talking to feel briefly like the most interesting person available. He'd been present at several family events in the preceding year. Not a constant presence, the kind of presence that builds familiarity through repetition rather than intensity. Enough dinners, enough weekend gatherings at houses where Charlotte was also present. And Charlotte. I'm being Charlotte, which is to say perceptive in a way that tends to unseat adults who aren't prepared for it, had developed a genuine fondness for him. This isn't unusual. Children form attachments to adults who treat them like people rather than accessories. Tom, according to the catering staff member who watched it unfold over a series of events, had a habit of talking to Charlotte, like she was worth the effort of an actual conversation, not performing for her. Not the exaggerated jolly uncle energy some adults deploy around children like a shield. I guess he'd ask her things, real things, and then he'd actually wait for the actual answer. She'd shown him a drawing she was working on at one gathering, a detailed thing, horses and a scene she was composing from memory. He'd asked about specific choices she'd made. Hey, why that hill? Plus, why the horse on the left was slightly smaller. She'd lit up, which that particular ignition that happens when someone pays attention to your interior world and it turns out they meant it. My source described Charlotte as the kind of child who files things away. What she'd filed away was, this person sees me. That's the whole story, really. Except it isn't. The particular event that triggered everything happened at a private gathering at Windsor in mid-September. It wasn't a formal occasion, one of those intermediate social events that exist in royal life between the public ceremonials and the completely private family moments. A hosted lunch that extended into the late afternoon, adults circulating, children in that managed semi-freedom that's their lot at adult events. Charlotte had, for what it's worth, would at some point in the afternoon, gone to find Tom. My estate administration source was in an adjacent room handling a logistical matter and heard rather more than she was meant to. Charlotte had apparently had something to tell him. Something she'd been saving. She'd finished. The drawing, the horses, the landscape. And she'd been working on it for 3 months, adding to it, refining it, holding it in her mind as a thing she was making for someone. She'd brought it, in a card envelope, carefully carried. She found him in a side drawing room. He wasn't alone. He was in the middle of what was clearly an adult conversation, animated, absorbed, the kind of conversation where the participants are leaning slightly toward each other, and the rest of the room has ceased to exist for them. He saw Charlotte come in. He gave her the efficient, apologetic smile of an adult in the middle of something, the kind that says, "Not now, sweetheart," and returned to his conversation. That was all. That was genuinely all that happened. No cruelty, no dismissal with any weight behind it. A busy adult at a social gathering, mid-conversation, not available in that precise moment. The reason, it landed the way it did is something I've turned over and over. My estate administration source said she heard the drawing room door open and close. Then nothing. Then, maybe 2 minutes later, something that she described as a sound I'd rather not have heard from the corridor. Not crying, she was careful to say. Charlotte was not basically the kind of child who cried easily, particularly not in spaces where she might be found. It was a sound she struggled to name and eventually called controlled. Like something being put away, she said, very deliberately. The envelope wasn't brought out again that afternoon. Charlotte returned to the main gathering. Pretty much, she was fine. Entirely fine. Collected and composed, and the image of a child who's doing perfectly well, which isn't the same thing as a child who's doing perfectly well. She was 9 years old, pressing something down that the adults around her weren't equipped to see, because the adults around her were looking for the kind of distress they could categorize. She, for what it's worth, didn't show. Anyone the drawing. She took it home. I think about the walk back to wherever they were keeping the children's coats that afternoon, the drawing in its careful envelope, and the decision made in the space of a corridor to fold something up and put it somewhere internal where it couldn't be seen. 9 years old is old enough to know that certain hurts aren't going to be understood if you display them. It's old enough to have clocked through the particular education that palace life provides that you protect things by not showing them. The white knuckles at the window, sort of. A few weeks later, hands flat against the cold October glass. Same gesture, really. Same girl, and holding it. The thing about William is that he notices his children. I want to be precise about that, because it would be easy to make it sound like an obvious baseline, which actually it is for some parents and absolutely isn't for others. And the particular shape of William's childhood makes the fact of his enticing meaningful rather than incidental. He didn't inherit the emotional attunement automatically. He built it. Carefully, to be fair. The way you build things when you've watched something important be done wrong and decided you're going to try differently. Look, he notices Charlotte especially. This is honestly something my protection officer source, who worked in proximity to the family during the relevant period, mentioned more than once and clearly not by accident. She's the one he watches, was how he put it. Not because he worries, because he's interested in her. Charlotte, for her part, runs a fairly tight operation when it comes to what she lets her father see. She's inherited something from both sides of her family that's perhaps the most double-edged gift the Windsor line has to offer. The ability to be entirely present in a room while keeping the actual interior weather completely private. She smiles. She engages. She says the right things. The gap between for what it's worth, what she shows, and what she carries is, by all accounts, already a professional grade gap for a 9-year-old. This is what made the next part dangerous. The following weekend after the Windsor gathering, the Wales family were at Anmer Hall. The kind of low-key family weekend that exists between the public schedule and the next public schedule. Children around, staff reduced, the general loosening that happens when the ceremonial pressure comes off. William came upon a Charlotte in the room she uses as a kind of workspace. She draws there, which has her own things arranged in, an order she maintains with the mild obsession of a child who finds orderliness stabilizing. Books, pencils organized by color, a few things she's made pinned to a board. He noticed something was off with the arrangement. My protection officer source wasn't in the room, he was in the adjacent space and the door was open. But he heard enough to reconstruct the shape of it. William actually had apparently noticed the absence of something. Whether he knew about the drawing, namely, or whether he simply registered the negative space where something had been, my source couldn't say. But William had asked about it, lightly. The way he does, not pressing but genuinely asking. What happened to the horse drawing? So which the landscape one, the big one. Charlotte had said she'd put it away. Plus, he'd asked where. She'd said she didn't know, which was not true. Obviously. The envelope was in her room, apparently behind a row of books, behind the collected works of someone she wasn't currently reading. William had let it go. He's not an interrogator. Plus, he registered that she didn't want to go there, and he pulled back. But my source said what stuck with him, and what he apparently mentioned to someone on the household staff in a way that wasn't quite meant to be heard, was the expression on Charlotte's face in the moment she said she didn't know. Wrong word for it, my source said. He told someone later it wasn't sadness, which he said it looked like she was managing something. He didn't pursue it, but he filed it. And this TBH is the part of the story that required the most careful cross-referencing because it involves a conversation that my 3 sources only partially overlap on. What seems to have happened, in the days following, pieced together, is that William began asking quiet questions, not of Charlotte, around her, the protective intelligence gathering that parents do when They sense a bruise they haven't located yet. He spoke to Kate first, presumably. That conversation, well, is opaque to all three of my sources. What Kate said, what she knew, whether she knew more than she let on, that's a closed room, and it stayed closed. What I can tell you is what came out the other side of it, which is that William began to form a picture. The Windsor lunch, the afternoon, the side drawing room. Plus, he didn't learn all of it. He learned enough. And he learned that Charlotte had gone to find Tom, that Tom had been occupied, that Charlotte had come back to the main gathering without whatever she'd gone to that room to do. This, on its own, looks like nothing. An adult busy at a party, plus a child who had to wait. The story of every adult social event in history. Except that William knew about the drawing. He'd known she was working on it. She'd mentioned it once, in passing. Which is Charlotte's version of enthusiastic endorsement. And he'd clocked it the way he clocks everything about her. And he understood, the way you understand things about your own children that you can't fully articulate, that the drawing had been for Tom specifically. He understood what she'd carried to that room. He understood what she'd carried out of it. Hey, here is where the question of what William was or wasn't meant to learn becomes genuinely complicated. Because Kate apparently knew more of the story before William did. How much more is unclear, but my catering staff source, who was present at the Windsor gathering and had a clearer view of the afternoon than anyone else, believes that Kate had spoken to Charlotte that evening, in the car on the way back, and that Charlotte had said more than she would have said to her father. This isn't unusual in any family. There is usually one parent who receives the fuller version, the parent the child trusts to receive it without making it bigger or louder or turning it into an action item. Kate is apparently that parent, which she chose not to bring William into the full picture immediately. Whether this was a judgment call about Charlotte's privacy or a protective instinct about what William might do with the information, or simply a sense that it needed time to settle, my sources can only speculate. What my estate administration source is confident about, based on a conversation she was adjacent to, is that Kate actively said something to William that pulled him back from pursuing it further. She apparently told him it was dealt with, that Charlotte was fine, that it was one of those moments children have and recover from, and don't need excavated by well-meaning parents who turn a private wound into a family incident. What she didn't tell him was the specific content, the drawing, the envelope, the controlled sound in, the corridor. She gave him the outline without the interior. Now, William, almost for what it's worth, found out the rest of it. This is the part my protection officer source is most precise about because he was there. About a week after the Anmer weekend, there was a smaller gathering at which Tom Parker Bowles was also present. A lunch, which informal, the kind of occasion where the seating isn't prearranged and people drift and settle according to preference. Charlotte was present at part of it. William ended up in conversation with Tom at some point in the afternoon. My source, positioned appropriately to observe without being visible, said the conversation was entirely normal for most of its duration. Comfortable. The easy circulation of adults at a family-adjacent event. And then William had apparently asked, not from any evident suspicion, but as simple table conversation, the light inquiry that keeps social momentum going, whether Tom had seen much of Charlotte lately, whether she'd shown him anything she was working on. My source kind of, said Tom had paused, plus not a long pause, the fraction of a second that most people wouldn't clock. Pretty much, but William clocked it. Tom said no, not recently, said it pleasantly, said she was brilliant, that child, said something complimentary about her focus and how seriously she took her work, and moved the conversation on. My source, honestly, said William had gone still in a very specific way during Tom's answer. Not pretty much, visibly still, and not the stillness other people wouldn't. the honestly interior kind, which is visible only to someone who has spent significant time reading the body language of a person operating under careful emotional management. He didn't say anything. For what it's worth, didn't push, didn't react. You know? The conversation continued. Later, my source observed William standing near the window looking out at something that wasn't there, for long enough that it registered. The expression on his face, my source said, was not anger. It was a calculation. Well, he was working something out. He left the event shortly after. What I believe well, and this is inference, not testimony, is that William arrived at something close to the full picture in that moment. Not because Tom lied well or badly, but because William is the kind of person who, once he begins to look, tends to see, and he saw that Tom knew something had occurred. He saw the careful pleasantness of a man navigating a social situation where something has gone slightly wrong, and the appropriate response is to smooth over it gracefully. He saw his daughter's drawing in the gap between the words. What he didn't pretty much do, and this is what Kate had in some essential way managed, was make it a thing. He didn't confront Tom. He didn't revisit Charlotte with fresh questions. He didn't make the private wound a family incident. He filed it, and he went home. I've, thought a great deal about what the right version of that restraint looks like and what it costs. Because the thing about not making a wound louder is that it requires you to carry the weight of it in silence, too. But William found something out about his daughter that afternoon. Not everything, but enough. And he absorbed it in the way he absorbs most things about his children that he can't fix, with the specific patience of a parent who understands that not everything is his to mend. He was never supposed to know that much. Kate had tried to keep him at the outline. He ended up somewhere between the outline and the interior, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable place to land. Close enough to hurt, not close enough to act on. Charlotte, by all kind of accounts, has no idea how much her father had figured out. She went on believing, as children go on believing when adults are doing their jobs properly, that her private thing had stayed private. The sort of drawing stayed behind the books. William went home. Yeah, and the house held its specific weighted silence, pretty much like it always has, like it always does. I went back to the Palace route on a Tuesday in November. Normal delivery, plus cold morning. The proper cold now, not the half-hearted autumn version. The kind of cold that means it and doesn't apologize for it. The horse chestnuts were bare. The iron fence was doing its usual patient standing. Everything was exactly as it always was, which is one of the things about these places. They absorb everything and reflect nothing back. The walls don't change. The stone doesn't comment. I wasn't looking for anything this time, which I'd been turning this story over for weeks by then, assembling it from my 3 careful sources, trying to understand what it was actually about. Because on its surface, it doesn't appear to be about anything. A child was hurt in a small way by an adult who wasn't paying attention. This happens with such regularity across every class and circumstance of human life that cataloging it would require a library. An adult was busy at a party. A little girl had to learn the ordinary lesson that she can't. Always be the most important thing in the room. This isn't a scandal. There are no villains. Tom Parker Bowles didn't do anything wrong. I guess, and yet. I've come to think that the story is actually about the specific difficulty of being Charlotte, not a princess, in the general abstraction. Charlotte, this particular child, with her careful arrangements and her serious attention and her habit of filing things away, who decided at some point in a corridor at Windsor that the safest thing to do with her hurt was to make it invisible. As she's 9 years old, and she already has a professional-grade gap between what she carries and what she shows. That's not a feature, that's a cost. The education that royal life provides, the particular curriculum of composed public presentation, the training in how to be looked at without being seen. That education was running in her without anyone necessarily having sat her down and taught it. She'd absorbed it. the way children absorb the unspoken rules of whatever world they've been born into. She'd looked at the adults around her and she'd understood, without being told, that this is how you do it. Look, you don't display, you manage. You take the thing that hurts and you put it behind the books where it isn't visible. I don't think anyone wanted that for her specifically. I think they'd all say, if asked, that they want her to have the freedom to be hurt in a normal way, to bring things to them, to not carry weight alone in corridors. I think William means that. I think Kate means it. But meaning something and creating the conditions for it are different operations. The palace has its silence and its weight. The family has its public architecture, its careful management, its professional distance between the interior and the exterior. Charlotte has been watching all of it since she was old enough to watch anything. She learned, I guess, the lesson she was taught. What happened, in the weeks following the November lunch where William nearly arrived at the full picture, is quieter and in some ways more important than the events that preceded it. My catering staff source told me this part. She was present at a smaller family occasion, mid-November, where it was just Wales' household. No extended family, no Camilla, no Tom. The kind of day that doesn't get photographed or noted anywhere. Charlotte had apparently been drawing again, plus a new one. Not the horses. Something different. My source couldn't see it well enough to describe it, only that Charlotte was at the table in the corner with her pencils arranged in their specific order, and she was working with the concentrated focus that my sources all describe as her particular signature. William had come to find her at some point in the late afternoon, sat down near her, didn't make a project of it, which just sat. He'd apparently said, and my source is careful to say she only caught part, of this, and the tail end of it, that whatever Charlotte was working on looked complicated, and that complicated things were worth working on. Charlotte had apparently said nothing for a moment. Then she'd said she wasn't sure who it was for yet. My source said William had nodded like that was a complete and sensible answer. He hadn't pushed, and he'd stayed. There's a version of parenting that's fundamentally about about identifying the problem and addressing it, about making the hurt stop and ensuring the child knows that you intervened and that you're available to intervene again. This version is legible and reassuring and measurable. Then there's the version that's about staying in the room. Just staying. Plus not making it loud, not extracting the thing that hurts and examining it under better light, and sitting near a child who has learned to pack things away very carefully, and not asking her to unpack them, and trusting that your presence in the room is its own kind of message. William sat with his daughter for a while. She drew. He didn't ask about the envelope. She didn't offer it. But my source said, and this is the detail that stayed with me more than any other detail in this story. That look, at some point while he was sitting there, Charlotte had shifted slightly in her chair. Just a small adjustment of posture. The movement you make when you stop bracing. Something released, not named, not fixed, just slightly released. Here's what I believe about the drawing behind the books. I believe it stays there for a while, maybe a long while. Charlotte isn't the kind of person who retrieves things before she's ready. And readiness for her has its own internal timeline that doesn't answer to external pressure. But I also believe, and this is entirely my own reading, offered without any claim to certainty, that it doesn't stay there permanently. That somewhere in the sequence of continued life and continued dinners and continued gatherings where Tom Parker Bowles is present being charming and genuinely good with children, Charlotte arrives at a morning where she takes the envelope out from behind the collected works of whoever she's not currently reading, and she looks at the drawing, and the drawing is just a drawing, not a wound, not a rejection, not, evidence of the particular humiliation of having offered something to someone who wasn't in the room to receive it. Just a drawing she made, a good one. Horses and a landscape she composed from memory with considered choices about hills and scale. And she decides what to do with it from there. Pretty much that's her interior. Hers to manage. I've been back to the route 3 times since I started piecing this story together. The palace doesn't give anything away. It never has. It's been holding the weight of lives inside its walls for centuries. The private griefs, private joys, and private small disasters of people who have no choice but to maintain a public composure alongside whatever is actually happening in the interior. The fence stands where it stood. The path curves where it's always curved, and I looked up at the 3rd-floor window on my last pass. East side, narrow stone frame. No one there, which isn't a relief exactly and isn't a disappointment. It's just what it is. An empty window, a building that keeps its silence. A family navigating, as all families handle, the distance between what they mean and what they manage and what their children, watching carefully, take away from the gap. Charlotte is 9 years old, and she already knows how to hold things in a cold corridor. She also honestly has a father who sits in rooms without requiring anything of her. Both of those things are true at the same time. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it isn't. The window was empty. The morning was cold. I made my delivery and went on. That's all any of us do, really. Carry the thing until we figure out who it belongs to. Sometimes it's us. Sometimes it turns, actually, out to be something we were making for someone who just wasn't in the room yet. She'll figure it out. She's already the kind of person who keeps working on complicated things.